I'm Nick Comer-Calder. I'm an Associate Fellow at the think tank, the Institute for Public Policy Research, aka IPPR. A long time ago, I was at the BBC, and then I was also at Discovery Channel, which is kind of why I'm here, I guess. As the producer of this session, I thought it would be helpful for you to set it in the context, in a wider context, which is that for the last 2 years, I've been heading up an IPPR project looking to engage with the media to explore new approaches to climate change. The project has two broad propositions. One is that media coverage has a significant impact on public understanding and interest in climate change. And secondly, that there are untapped creative opportunities within the issue of climate change. We understand, I in particular understand with my television background, that it's a difficult subject and it has a bit of a reputation as being a ratings killer. But the question then is, well, then do you just run away from that, or do you see it as a challenge? And going back a bit, HIV/AIDS was seen as a very difficult subject initially, and then was picked up by the media and very rapidly came into the mainstream of our lives and was understood and became not that awful and scary thing. IPPR believe, along with most of the science community, that climate change is one of the most pressing issues of the time. And we are hosting this session as part of our wider project, but this is a chance for you to hear some from a couple of scientists who have a particular interest in the areas of climate change, and also to have a conversation with filmmakers and a broadcaster about their approaches to climate change. It's not an easy subject, but we hope by setting up more of these kind of opportunities for dialogue between broadcasters, newspapers, scientists, and experts in this area, we can get something moving. And ultimately, what I hope is that some of you are going to walk away from here thinking, oh, actually, there's something in here that I didn't know about, and maybe I'll give it some more thought. I'm going to be around for some time after the session. Some of the panelists will be here as well if you're interested in talking to them. And I just want to end by giving my profound personal thanks to everyone for coming, especially Lorraine and Chris, who have trekked some distance to come here, and to John Smithson, who stepped in at very late notice to chair the meeting. And I must acknowledge formally the JJ Charitable Trust, who are funding this event. Thank you. John, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for coming. I used to run a company called Darlow Smithson, and now run a new one called Arrow Media, and we've done a lot of hundreds of hours of science and history and current affairs programs over the years. And what's interesting is never once have I pitched an idea on climate change or indeed any environmental issue. And there's sort of one very good reason for that, as Nick was implying. It's a ratings death zone, simple as that. And is it an important issue? Absolutely. But we only pitch ideas we think will get commissioned, and we've never found an idea that we think will get made. You could argue that global terrorism and the consequences of climate change are equally important issues, global issues that affect us all. How come I've made about 9 or 10 films on 9/11 and the consequences, and not a single film to do with climate change? Indeed, I can think of very few TV programs that have been made on climate change that have really had any impact or resonated in any way. Indeed, it's ironic that the one that probably created the most heat and noise was the famous or infamous Channel 4's Great Global Warming Conspiracy, a program, as most of you may know, that attacked the world of climate change research. Things have popped occasionally. Obviously, the Al Gore film, An Inconvenient Truth, did $30-odd million worth of business in the box office and picked up a couple of Oscars, but there's not been much else. So let's get into the whole thing and find out why. We've got a very big questions. Is climate change for real? Why does it not seem to hit home to the public if it is for real? And why, and is it for the same reasons, is it such a deadly no-go zone on TV? A very distinguished panel to answer those questions. To my immediate right, Professor Chris Rapley, who's the Professor of Climate Science at University College London and previously was Director of the Science Museum in London and Director of the British Antarctic Survey. To the right at the end there is Dr. Lorraine Whitmarsh. She's not a job I've heard of before, an environmental psychologist, specializing in perceptions and behavior in relation to climate change, energy and transport. And she's a fellow in the School of Psychology at Cardiff University in the UK. To my immediate left is Jeth Orlowski. Jeth is director of Chasing Ice, a film that had great success at Sundance, and I think has been picked up by National Geographic, is that right?
For television.
For television. The film follows acclaimed National Geographic photographer James Balog, who was once a skeptic about climate change. Balog used state-of-the-art time-lapse cameras, and the film follows him, measuring the movement of glaciers. Jeff produces some very beautiful images which very powerfully argue the case. At the end is Kim Schillinglaw, the queen or the princess of science television. You probably must commission more hours than virtually anyone else on science, and obviously very interested to know. I've never dared pitch, I pitched to Kim a lot, I never dared pitch an idea in this area, but let's find out why when we come to her. So that's the panel. Can I do a very quick check? I just find out where we're all on this issue. Broadly speaking, if you sort of believe that climate change is for real, that what the scientists are saying is something you think is broadly right and that it is something of enormous consequence, could you shove your hand in the air? Okay. And does anyone believe that it's overstated, overhyped, wrong, corrupt, a conspiracy, a swindle, whichever, but basically skeptical on the issue? Any skeptics in the audience? Half? Okay, I'll come to you later. Interesting, okay. So let's get into it, and first of all, Chris.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Can you all hear me okay? I decided not to use PowerPoint today, and maybe the reasons for that will emerge. I've called my talk, though, my narrative, Climate Science Chapter 4, and so it is a story in 4 parts. But I will just start with a statement, given that you are all apparently believers, but it seems that the key simple messages that the climate science community has not been particularly effective at getting across are that all of the colleagues who I respect, and I respect them because I know they strive to be impartial and not suffer from groupthink, agree on the following 4 things. That the energy balance of the planet is out of kilter and that there's a lot of energy accumulating, mainly in the oceans, and you see that in the temperature signal. So the world is warming. It's us this time. There are many reasons why the world's energy balance has been out of kilter in the past, but this time the evidence is pretty overwhelming that it's us. It matters because the modern world has been constructed, tuned to the climate system that we inherited, and we can see that we're not very well adapted even to the climate system that we've got, let alone the one that is emerging over the horizon. And then the 4th thing is that there are things that we can do about it. So those are the simple messages that we've rather failed to get across. I'm going to take 2 minutes just to give you an anecdote, because again it's relevant to where I've got to in this story, which I will tell in a second. When I was director of British Antarctic Survey, I used to drive the relatively short distance to work each day. Please don't ask me about my carbon emissions, but anyway, I used to. And I used to listen to the Today programme. And as often as not, there would be a point in this Today programme where, I don't know, a bomb had gone off in the tube or something, and the reporter would stick a microphone under somebody's nose and say, "How do you feel about this?" And I would suffer an immediate red mist and turn the damn thing off, because I didn't want to know how he felt. I wanted to know the facts. Missing the irony that by being asked what I felt about it, or listening to somebody else being asked what they felt about it, a huge surge of anger emerged. So we'll come back to that later. Now, the human impacts on the Earth system have suffered or been through what's been called the Great Acceleration. So from the 1950s, if you look at everything from carbon emissions to the number of McDonald's restaurants, population, dozens of factors, you see this great acceleration. And that's what has led the Nobel Prize winner Paul Crutzen to say that we've entered the geological era called the Anthropocene. That in itself is an interesting story. But I'm quite interested in the story of climate science itself, which suffered its great acceleration, or went through its great acceleration in the 1980s. And there were good reasons for that. All sorts of technologies were coming on stream: satellite technologies, aircraft technologies, ship technologies, computing, the internet perhaps a little bit later, that allowed the science community worldwide to address the planet as a system. And that opening of opportunities arrived just at the time, probably linked, that James Lovelock was talking about looking at the Earth as a combined system, the biology not just being a passenger, but being an active part of the system. And of course, people were recognizing that the human impact on the planet was growing. We'd had Silent Spring, we'd seen the ozone hole. So the situation was ripe for the science community, purely from the point of view of understanding how this complex object functioned, to go through a massive acceleration of effort and capability. And out of that has emerged an enormous amount of knowledge about how the planet works. Chapter 2 was the associated political reaction. 92, the Rio conference, which we're just going to start celebrating next week, 20 years of. So very high-level political engagement, the development of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the IPCC, and so on. And of course, this has been a major issue for politicians at the very highest level since then. Now, what we've seen is that their deliberations and negotiations have failed, because carbon emissions continue to grow, land use change continues to run unfettered. And so although many people have attempted to address these issues, and many initiatives have been taken by governments, industry, and people, they have been overwhelmed by the tide of growth that's occurred elsewhere on the planet, which has, for all sorts of perfectly reasonable reasons, ignored or overwhelmed this view that something needs to be done. Now, chapter 3 has been really interesting. This has really built up over the last few years most strongly, and is exemplified by the extreme political polarization on the issue of climate change in the United States. It's sort of post-climate gate, where the integrity of the science and the scientists was brought into question. It's a result of, we know, a very long period of vested interests working to defend their interests, as one might expect them to do. But it's also been more than that. It's been a growing reaction, a permission of people to, if you like, deny or reject the evidence. And it's really interesting that there are, this sounds a bit patronizing, but there are very clever people who have decided, for some reason or another, either emotional, psychological, or ideological, that they are rejecting the evidence that climate change is real. And indeed, research shows that the better versed they are in science, the more effective they are at assembling the arguments to protect their position and indeed engage others and argue their position. But we know that emotions and ideology, beliefs, values, and attitudes, when those collide with facts and evidence, it's generally the facts and evidence that come off worst. So that we haven't seen the end of that chapter. In fact, even today, I received a copy of a new book by Donna Laframboise, a journalist, investigative journalist in France, who has essentially come up with a 150-page book that trashes the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And one has to say that a lot of the stuff that she's revealed is very disconcerting and very difficult to defend. But if I just quote you from part of it, she says, "Let's be sensible for a moment. Planet Earth is 4.5 billion years old. During that time, it's endured all sorts of perfectly natural climate transformations," and goes on to describe them, then finishes the paragraph by saying, "To suggest that the climate has ever been within human control is surely a bit silly." So here again is somebody who's done actually a really rather good job at exposing hubris and a lack of transparency in the IPCC, but who confuses flaws in the process with flaws in the conclusion, because what she said is just wrong. Now, contrast that with the representatives of northern peoples who I met in Montreal recently, and also representatives of major UK companies who were at a workshop at PricewaterhouseCoopers day before yesterday, who say, no, it's real. We're seeing it already. We're having to change our supply chains. We're having to take action to manage our business so that we can survive what is already happening. So what's the fourth chapter? Well, the fourth chapter we haven't really quite entered yet. I think that the science community is in denial. I don't think it's used to the rough and tumble of this real world. And I don't think it's done a very good job on thinking through what its role is. Is it here to advocate policy, or is it here to provide scientific evidence and let others do the policy? There's been a lot of mixed messages and muddled thinking in that respect. It certainly doesn't know how to deal with public dialogue when it is forced by its rules to rely on a rational discussion of facts, when others with whom they're having a dialogue can use character assassination and all of the other techniques to win the argument. And talking to my colleagues, there is a concern that many of them feel that the kitchen has got too hot, that they've got a terribly demanding day job to go and do the science anyway, and so are retreating from the forum, leaving it open to others to enter. So it does seem to me that the fourth chapter, which many of us will try and develop, is the time when the science community regroups, rationalizes itself, and hopefully begins better to get its messages across, recognizing that the information deficit model doesn't work, and that the Radio 4 approach to linking to emotions and emotional reactions is a key that they need to understand a great deal better. I see this as the greatest drama that's playing out in the modern world. Far more dramatic and far more important than the sort of thrashing of the economy monster, deeply wounded at present, will Greece stay in or not? That is a tiny issue compared with what we are confronted with if indeed we trash the planet, as I believe we could well do. If we don't take action soon, carbon dioxide could be at 1,000 parts per million at the end of the century, and we'd be in serious trouble. So my final point then is that in spite of the fact that this issue for some reason seems to be toxic, it's a great shame because it is the greatest drama that's playing out in the modern world, and I'm amazed that people aren't picking it up and running with it. Thank you.
But it's sort of interesting that you're sort of admitting that you're part of the problem. You're saying there's a big problem, but you're part of the problem because you're not getting the message across, because you're too busy, or which is...
But that's not the scientist's responsibility. I mean...
Well, surely it's the job of a scientist to, blow the whistle when they discover, how would we know about the link between cancer and smoking?
Have been trying to do that. Well, the same problems that we're facing with the climate change issue are the same problems that we face with the smoking industry. And there's such a concerted, well-funded effort to intentionally confuse the issue and create a FUD campaign, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I don't want to kind of steer the conversation in a different path, but
we'll come to the media bit in a minute. But
can I just be clear, though? That wasn't what I was saying. I was saying I think this is a fantastic story, and I would have thought it was material that program makers would be interested in. But I wasn't saying that the climate science community didn't have a obligation to deal with this. That's what my chapter 4 is all about, that they've got to do a damn sight better job than they've done up until now.
Right.
But that's part of the problem, though, isn't it? It's a toxic issue for us because you can't find the commitment, the passion. I don't know, the message seems to be the same record being played time and time again. But I've not yet seen who the figures that have really been passionate, that have really made, Al Gore was the first one that really punched through on the...
But there are so many scientists who have tried to do that, and at every step of the way, whether it's in debates, whether it's in public statements, they get attacked vehemently for expressing their expertise. The other part of the problem is that the scientific community is so cautious about representing what they know to be 100% true, and when they speak out publicly, they're hesitant to make any sort of logical conclusions or jumps to predictions that they don't stand behind 1,000%. The scientific community is the most conservative community in terms of representing any sort of projections. They do not want to be considered fearmongers. They do not want to be considered, radical extremists who are trying to scare people into taking action now. And so when you have that mindset of there are so many huge risks for the scientific community if they were to stick their neck out and risk their careers and risk being published. What are the advantages for them to try and make it? They're trying to do it, but they're being attacked at every step of the way.
Isn't that a hugely sad state of affairs? If
is.
you're saying the consensus, the overwhelming consensus of scientists is in the existence of
97%.
yeah, and then well, that's a shocking state of affairs.
Well, they do stand up and say it, and you know, occasionally they do get death threats and all sorts of vituperative stuff on the web if you ever bother to read it. But nevertheless, what is not the case at present, if you take Nigel Lawson's Global Warming Policy Foundation, how can you characterise that? It's reasonably well funded, although we don't know by who or by how much. But it's on the front foot. It's persistent, consistent, and it has simple messages, and it also has messages that people want to hear, i.e., don't worry, everything's fine, you know, forget it. The science community is not like that. There is no source from the science community of consistent, persistent, simple messaging, and that is a serious discrepancy that the community needs to fix.
And I think part of the problem, I mean, I'm neutral in all this, but for the purposes of this, there's a sense, I think, talking to some colleagues last night, who are producers like I am, that the crying wolf syndrome, that people have been, you may not accept this, but this is the feeling just within the program makers, who we bear our responsibility for not getting the message across, just as you bear responsibility for not getting the message across. But the crying wolf syndrome, that this often apocalyptic message has been said time and time and time again, and to the average viewer, it's not happened. I mean, of course you will say there's overwhelming evidence that it is happening, but as far as we're concerned, it's not happening. So do you accept that that has been part of the problem? It's rather like the global pandemic. How many times have virologists predicted the global pandemic that's going to wipe us out? It hasn't happened yet. Doesn't mean it won't happen. Let Chris go first.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. You know, it's confusing. It's confusing your personal evidence, and you know, somebody, Bjorn Lomborg said his grandmother lived to be nearly 100. And when he asked her of the events that she thought were significant in her life, she didn't remember to say that sea level had risen 13 centimetres or something. You know, because it's been a very slow rise. The point is that unless people, Machiavelli said that unless people have long experience of something, they're very unlikely to react to it. And that's been a perfectly reasonable human position over human history. Unfortunately, with climate change, by the time you begin to experience it here, it will be too late, because we will have committed ourselves to things which will be highly disruptive, very disruptive of the modern world. And that is a problem. There was an article a year or so ago that said the worst thing that happened to climate science, or the best thing that happened to earthquake science, was that it was evident from the start that you would not be able to predict when, where, and how big an earthquake would be. So the intersection between the science community and society has been to do with resilience and recovery, building codes and recovery systems. The worst thing that happened to climate science was that it emerged from the meteorological forecasting community, and there is an assumption that with a bigger computer and a bit more time, the community will be able to be precise in defining exactly what the threats are to you as a whatever you are. And unfortunately, that's not true. It's very difficult to do that. And because people can't visualize the threat, they tend to assume that this is alarmist nonsense, but I'm afraid it isn't.
But, okay, you accept that the scientific community is partially to blame. Dump on us as well. How come commissioners like Kim or myself or many of the faces I recognise here, fellow science producers, how come we don't want to go near this subject? Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think that ClimateGate, I mean, I don't know. I'm not inside your heads, and I don't...
No, but I'm interested in your perspective as well.
Okay, well, I think that ClimateGate's been very damaging to many correspondents, particularly environmental correspondents, who had been, if you like, pushing the subject because they genuinely believed that it was important as
I assume everyone's familiar with ClimateGate.
You know, in spite of the fact that the science was exonerated and the behaviour of the scientists was sort of exonerated, I think commissioning editors and editors of newspapers felt that there was evidence that environmental journalists had gone native, hadn't been giving the science community a hard enough time, had been led up the garden path, they feel let down. So I think the subject has become particularly toxic in the last 2 years. That's an opinion. I don't know if it's right or not.
My response to that is that it's journalism's fault that it's turned into this. And part of the logic here is that the tradition in journalism is to cover both sides of any opinion. And you cover one side of the story, and then you go and you find an opposing side of the story, and you cover that equally. And with the reality of climate change, there's a 97% accordance amongst the climate scientists that this is happening and that it's real, and there's 3% opposition. So why do you give even time to both sides of this so-called debate when there's clearly a very skewed scientific perspective? So it gets to the point where there's so much content that is so much of it is bickering, so much of it is back and forth. They're finding the same dozen or so climate skeptics who speak out on a regular basis in the American media, at least, that's as much as I can speak for mostly. But you see the same handful of people speaking on a very regular basis about why climate change is a fraud, why it's a hoax. And so the American public then gets this mindset that, oh, the scientists are confused, the scientists don't know what's going on, they can't accurately speak to the truth of the scenario. And so the American public is completely just, they're tired of it, they're exhausted of this issue because of, I would argue, to a large degree what the journalistic field has done in perpetuating the vision, the illusion that there is a hoax behind this. That's my response.
I accept America as a problem as well, when you've got serious people believing 9/11 was a conspiracy in the World Trade Center.
Yes.
Well, I
wanted
of the
to actually...
nonsense has talked about that. Kim,
Right,
can I just bring you in?
yeah.
We'll go into later in more detail. But what's your view? Is it the scientists to blame for not getting the message across, or us to blame for not putting it on screen in a way that will engage our audience?
I think first of all, I'm not sure that I recognise the assertion that we're actually doing less climate change coverage since Climategate. I mean, I can't pretend to have totted up the minutes, but that really isn't my personal perception at the BBC. Again, I can't speak for other broadcasters.
It's not mine either, I don't think.
So I would dispute that. Also, it's not true at the BBC, at the very least, that we represent both sides of the debate, if there could be said to be both sides of the debate, with equivalence. We've had a long standing discussion within the BBC to confirm that the notion of balance in science is fundamentally different from the notion of balance that pertains across the rest of BBC output, particularly in things like politics or debate around social issues. So I would push back very, very strongly on the idea that we, at the BBC at any rate, have given some sort of equivalence to climate change science and climate change skeptics. That's not to say that some programmes have not sought to explore what it means to be a climate change skeptic, and I think that has its place. But I would push back very strongly
that's great,
on that
because
idea.
once again, I'm not super familiar
Of course,
with the BBC
no, I wasn't taking it as a personal accusation, but I think it's important as a sort of a statement of record, if you like. So, John, sorry, I don't know, I lost sight of what the question was. But,
but I mean, who's to blame? Chris
who's
or you?
to blame? Well, listen, I think, well, I would always say Chris, clearly. No, I think that the issues that bedevil, if that's the right word, coverage of climate change issues are complex, and I'm not really prepared to sort of put it down to broadcaster or scientist. If you, for the purposes of a spicy debate, I would certainly say that the science community has not helped itself in the way in which it has fully engaged with the debate around risk and uncertainty, and particularly evidential uncertainty. I thought the point that Chris made about climate science emerging from the meteorological community is a really, or a large contribution, having made by that, is a really, really, really important one. Later on, we'll show some clips from our output, and there's a programme that I was personally, particularly, I didn't make it, it was a Horizon, didn't make it myself, but I was particularly, I liked it a lot because it looked at a phenomenon called global weirding, which is, rather than sort of, we're all going to be inundated with sort of, shed loads of rain and New York will be sort of flooded, or rather than, everything's going to be a sort of desert, it looked at instability in weather patterns, which is a really interesting, I mean, Chris would know far more about this than I would. But one of the sort of sub-themes of it was evidential uncertainty, and as things like data collection get they become much, much more sophisticated, we're able to play into the models a lot more variables. And the interesting thing about that is it makes prediction actually harder, or certainty around prediction harder, whereas I think the general public would assume, oh, you've got more data, you've got more variables, your machines are more sophisticated, very soon you're going to be able to tell us exactly the year in which New York is going to be inundated by exactly how many metres of water. In fact, it's the opposite. And I think one of the interesting things about this debate is I think science and the media are going to have to get much more sophisticated about how they convey risk, uncertainty, and evidential uncertainty in science, generally, and particularly in climate change.
I think now's a good time to bring in Dr. Lorraine Whitmarsh, because we're trying to understand what it is about the public perception of these issues, why there is this clear problem if there's this overwhelming scientific consensus. So, Lorraine, what's your research, this whole thing of, was it public perceptions and behaviour in relation to climate change, energy and transport? What's your take on this?
Yeah, well, I have some slides. Is now
Yes,
the time to...
that would be excellent.
Okay. I don't know. How shall I...
There you go.
Oh, great. So I was going to... Actually, that's good. I was just going to ask and answer two questions, actually. I wanted to basically talk about what do people think about climate change based on our research and other people's research, and how are we doing in terms of engaging the public? And we've started to talk about that already. So we know that people know about climate change. It's well known amongst the public, but people do see it as distant. It's a distant risk. It's something which is seen as affecting other people. And that's demonstrated by, for example, this graph. This is research which colleagues have done. They surveyed the UK public to ask them, how serious a threat do you see climate change to you, people in your local community, people in the UK, people in other countries? And as you can see, the perceived severity goes up the further away you get from you, the individual, even within your own country. Part of that is about people's general tendency to be optimistic when it comes to risks. So people don't like to see themselves as being at risk of things. But there is clearly something going on with climate change. It is a long-term issue. It's something which is global. And at least in the UK, probably the worst risks are going to be befalling other countries as well. So there is a genuine psychological distance. That's what we're calling it. So it's a challenge for communicators how to overcome that distance. Related to that, and I think this might sort of address some of the issues we've been talking about, is this idea of what psychologists call the availability heuristic, which is basically, this is how easy it is to think of something. So how sort of top of your mind is an issue. And that is very strongly linked to our direct experience. So we're sort of preoccupied by things that we directly experience and things that are in the media a lot and recently. So if you just look at this example, this is a graph from some Mori polling data across about a decade or so. And they regularly poll the public to say what's the most important issue facing Britain today. And the green line shows the percentage of people who say it's the environment that's the most important issue. The first thing you'll see is that it's a minority of people. It's only sort of 5-10% in general who say the environment's important. So I think this speaks to the issue of maybe why it's not a topical issue to be kind of making documentaries about, is that people don't necessarily think it's the most important concern for them. But the other thing I think to say is that look how jaggy the line is. People are it's really volatile how concerned people are about the environment. And it seems to be, and Maury have very conveniently mapped on to the graph, events that occurred over this time frame. It seems to be that people's concern about environment goes up when there's some topical issues in the media or that people are directly experiencing, like the wettest the wettest autumn on record, some flooding in 2000, and particularly around this sort of peak where there was a lot of political events happening and campaigns, and the latest IPCC scientific report came out, plus a big hurricane. So it goes up when there's lots of kind of things in the press and people are experiencing relevant things. But the other thing to say is it goes down when there are other things in the press and that people are worried about, like terrorism, like 9/11, like the London bombing. And that relates to something else that's going on very recently. So since the peak in concern around 2007, we've actually seen a drop in concern about climate change and a growth in climate skepticism. This is across basically all countries, not just a UK or US thing. But about a year ago, the Mail jubilantly announced that the number of climate change skeptics has doubled in the last 4 years. And indeed, depending on which poll you look at, there has been a sharp increase in the number of people saying that they do not believe the world's climate is changing. It's still a minority, but nevertheless a growing one. Part of that, we think, that there's probably lots of reasons, but part of that's probably to do with the recession. Since about sort of 2007-8, people have been worrying about other things. So the environment has actually gone down in people's mind, and they're worrying about other things instead. This so-called idea of the finite pool of worry hypothesis. We can only worry about a certain number of things at the same time. We're worrying about money, so we're not worrying about the environment. But something else is going on which relates to the communication side of things. And this is, I think we've talked about this a bit, is that people do perceive that the issue has been exaggerated, and increasingly so. So there's a feeling that it's been hyped, and we're not really seeing what's kind of being portrayed on the TV and in the media more generally in our day-to-day lives. So there's a bit of a mismatch between all these kind of doom and gloom scenarios and what we're really seeing in the main. So there is a sense that it's been exaggerated, and there's a view that maybe people are just fed up of all this alarmist sort of messaging, and there is this kind of green fatigue that's setting in. So there's some clear implications for communication there. And the other thing on perceptions is that, of course, audiences are very diverse, so people hold different views about climate change. And what our research and other people's research shows is that it doesn't seem to be predicted by how much you know about the issue as to whether you believe in it and are concerned about it. It's also not actually to do with experience necessarily. So actually some of our work shows that people who've been flooded aren't necessarily more concerned. But what it does seem to be very strongly predicted by is political views. So Chris mentioned about this sort of the right of centre political groups are much more likely to be sceptical about climate change. And so that's demonstrated here in the US. There's a sharp divide between Democrat and Republican voters, but it is also evident actually in the UK. So people who vote for Conservatives and UKIP more likely to be sceptical. So there's something going on in terms of it being actually quite rooted in people's ideology and values, and much more than knowledge. So in terms of sort of communicating this and sort of how to get the public more interested in the issue, there's a whole lot of evidence and research that's been done over the last few decades that shows how to be effective at communicating in general. And so it's to do with things like, do you have a trusted and appealing source of information? What's your message? Is it persuasive? And there's various facets of that. Your audience, are they motivated to think about your message or not? And the context, so what are other people saying and what's kind of going on in general, and timing is a big issue there. And there's lots of research that I can't go into detail about that shows about how these kind of facets relate to communicating climate change specifically. So having independent scientists are seen as being particularly credible communicators of climate change, so people that don't have a vested interest, but also people that we think are like us and that are similar to us and share our values. The types of language we use, so we found that, for example, global warming is a term that evokes more concern than climate change. And the sort of tone of voice as well. So whereas scientists quite often use this sort of very objective tone, like it was found that, as if there wasn't a person there doing the science. Actually, some recent research shows that if you talk about we found and we believe and us, it's more persuasive, and you can actually bridge the gap between the sort of scientific community and the public a bit better. And I just want to talk about a couple of issues to do with audience and context now. We're sort of bombarded with a whole range of different messages when it comes to climate change, ranging from it's the end of the world through to it's a massive hoax and everything in between. So how do we make sense of all these messages? And what we know from research is that people are biased in how they process information. It's just a sort of a natural psychological phenomenon. One of the major biases is called confirmation bias. So we try and look for information which confirms what we already believe, and we ignore stuff which challenges us. That's particularly the case when there are mixed evidence or mixed messages, which is the case with climate change, lots of different views. So in one of our recent experiments, we gave people, so a group of participants, 2 editorials about climate change, which we'd written ourselves, but we tried to make them look real, and that used the sorts of language and claims that are made in the media, the press, to talk about climate change. So we gave everybody two editorials. One basically said the issue is a hoax and very exaggerated, so a sceptical one. And the other one said, we've really got to act, it's a big serious issue, and the science is stable. And we measured people's attitudes to climate change before and after reading these 2 editorials. And we found 2 things. First of all, people that tended to be more sceptical before they read the information rated the sceptical editorial as being the most reliable and the most convincing. So they actually saw that it was better evidence because it confirmed what they believed. And vice versa, the people that believed in climate change saw the other one as more reliable. But we also found that people who were more sceptical to start with became even more sceptical after reading these 2 editorials. So they were given sort of balanced or mixed information, but they came away actually their attitudes polarised. So the sceptics became more sceptical, the non-sceptics more convinced about the reality of climate change. So there's, again, implications for communication there. We tend to just believe what we want to believe, let's say. And just a final thought on fear, because, and relating this to the title of the session, in terms of the claim that climate change is increasingly communicated using alarmism and fear, and that it's been branded climate porn. And is this a good approach? Should we use fear? Well, the evidence suggests that that's probably a bad idea in general. One study gave members of the public images like these, particularly the sort of the typical drowning polar bear and the dried up lake one. And they found that indeed people did say climate change is an issue, we should definitely do something about it. So concern increased in the short term, but they found that the same images made people feel that they couldn't do anything about the issue, so that it decreased the extent to which people felt able to do anything. And the other thing they found was when they gave people images like this, kind of more mundane images of kind of people switching off lights and cycling and so on, people thought that it didn't necessarily make climate change seem important, but it did make them feel that they could do something. And some of the latest evidence shows that the best thing to do is to pair these 2 together. So give them the kind of, some of the climate change impacts information, but show people what they can do to overcome the risks as well. And definitely one of the things that we found most recently is that there is a need to ensure that we don't evoke a denial response because people feel threatened by the information. Because some of the messages are, climate change is big and scary, and you have to change your life in really horrible ways that kind of will mean you have to give up things that you really like. And that's very threatening to people. And so one of the key sort of points that we're finding is that actually more positive messages about, yes, we do have to sort of do something about it, but there are also co-benefits, so you can save money and you can be healthy and so on. Focusing more on the positives actually is more likely to overcome some of these psychological defense mechanisms. So just a few sort of concluding thoughts, really. It's about, I think, positive messaging, tailoring the information to people's concerns. I don't think more information will persuade skeptics. I think we just need to kind of talk about different issues, actually, with that group. Visualising energy and giving people advice on the behaviour changes that they might want to make. Using trusted sources, consistent messaging as well as Chris has said, and a kind of a broader point here about kind of media and scientific literacy. And I think this speaks to the issue about kind of balance. I mean, there is evidence that perhaps within sort of certain, I mean, this particular US evidence, but that there is a tendency for this journalism norm for balance to actually have an impact on the audience, so they do perceive that scientists are divided on the issue. But perhaps actually, if we communicated the fact more about the process of science to the public, they might have a deeper insight into sort of some of these contextual issues, and the fact also that uncertainty is an inevitable part of science. So actually it doesn't mean that the evidence is unreliable, that uncertainty is inherent in science. So yeah, that was what I wanted to finish on.
Thank you, Lorraine, that was fascinating. Given all your research into this area, what's your view on that sort of divide I've been trying to explore between is this the fault of the scientists, with Chris admitting they could do better, for getting the message across, or the fault of Kim and myself for not, and all of us, for not telling that message and bringing it to the public? Where would you cast your vote in that?
Can I sit on the fence and say it's a bit of both? But also I think that there are challenges inherent in the issue. I mean, I think it's just an incredibly difficult issue to communicate for a couple of reasons. First of all, environment, as we've seen, is not high on people's priorities anyway. So you could say, well, why should people who are trying to sort of make documentaries that are going to be of interest to people make them on topics that we know aren't necessarily sort of particularly priority topics. But the other thing is about climate change specifically is it challenges a lot of our assumptions and a lot of beliefs about kind of the world, really. So we can't just sort of keep on consuming as if there is an infinite amount of resources, and that there are some, challenges in terms of inequalities and so on. So there are threatening messages actually that I've sort of hinted at. So I think it's a difficult issue to communicate. I don't necessarily think that scientists are trained to do that communication though, so I think a lot of them do want to, and some of them do a good job, others not so much. So I do think it's about sort of working with the people who have the skills to communicate it. So yeah, I guess a bit of
And is this a British thing? Is this just our bolshiness and our skepticism and our denial of authority? Or you may not have done research on it, but would this be true of other sort of sophisticated countries?
You mean the levels of sort of skepticism?
Yeah.
No, I think the UK is the second most skeptical country in Europe after the Netherlands, but the US is way more skeptical. But there is a sort of, I mean, it's still not a majority of people. It's still, 15 or so % of people who are sort of fairly, ardent skeptics, let's say. A larger, sort of a middling sort of group of maybe 50 odd % who have some doubts, and then sort of I don't know, the rest are firm believers. So there's a kind of a range of views, I would say, and definitely skepticism is not that prevalent.
And it sounds to me like there would be nothing like a good old-fashioned disaster to get us to change our opinions. I mean, is there evidence in other countries where there have been natural disasters which would be attributable to climate change? I'm assuming that would must change opinion, mustn't it?
You would think. I think that the evidence is mixed. So I've actually done research on this myself. I compared people who'd been flooded and people that hadn't, and I found that there was absolutely no difference in their understanding of climate change. And that's partly because, and I think it's sort of quite sensible, that a specific flood event isn't necessarily attributable to climate change. I mean, it's sort of, there is a sort of a link, if you like, but it's not a direct causal sort of link. So for them, it's more important just to deal with the flooding issue that they're experiencing than to think about, well, maybe I should sort of drive less because of the sort of the global issue of climate change. So they're seen as somewhat separate things, but I think there could be something of a cumulative effect over time, possibly. The more disasters we have, maybe the more awareness will be raised, but I'm sort of not totally convinced.
Okay. Jeff, you come from the home of the climate change skeptics, and the home of most conspiracy theorists, I would guess. It seems film has been more successful, documentaries designed for theatrical have been more successful than actually television on the evidence that we can see. Before we talk about your specific film,
right.
What's your take on that?
I haven't spent much time thinking about that. Why the theatrical films?
Why did something like the Al
Truth.
Gore film
That
really
had a lot
resonate?
to do because it was Al Gore, and he kind of launched the issue and launched the topic, and he was the vice president. So there are a lot of things that were factors in that specific example. It's
And we just
arguably
Florida
unfair.
and-
It's arguably unfair for that
Yeah.
film to be compared to the vast majority of other climate change content.
I think there's also a difference in that most feature docs either play to, fundamentally they play to much smaller audiences.
Right.
Yeah.
They play to a captive audience. You pay your money, you sit down in a dark room. It takes quite a lot to walk out after
Right.
before the hour and a half is over. TV is a mass medium appealing to a much broader cross-section of society, in which, frankly, you can go and, chat to your kids or shout
Right.
at your husband instead of staying with the programme that's
Right.
on air or change channels. So they're fundamentally different exercises, I think.
Sure. Tell us a little about Chasing Ice, which
Yeah.
I guess many people haven't seen.
Has anybody here seen the film? We screened today, so there's
Yeah.
a third of the
Okay.
audience or so. So I come at this not as a climate expert by any means. I'm not a scientist. My background is in still photography, and I met this photographer, James Balog, who started working on this project about 5-6 years ago. And his idea was, because of this debate that's going on in America and this, lack of consensus on the issue of climate change, his mindset was, I'm going to go out and I'm going to make images that can hopefully become visual evidence of climate change. As was expressed, he was a skeptic about climate change earlier. He learned a lot of the science through ice core data, through various forms of data that kind of confirm all the same story. And so James wanted to create this evidence. So he came up with an idea to do time lapses of glaciers, and he went to the Arctic and he installed these cameras all around the Arctic to document what was going on. And at the beginning, my role in the project was just to help out. I was his assistant. I shot video. I was just regularly shooting video and going on these trips out to Iceland and Greenland and Alaska just to kind of serve multiple roles. And at the beginning, the intention was not to make a film. It was about 1.5 years into the project when James's time lapses really started to reveal this is what's going on, and the cameras were successful. We realized that they were working, and at that point in time, we decided we've got all this footage, we've got the material, we can make a feature documentary about this. And at that stage, I brought some producers on, brought a writer on. My producer did The Cove, and we had a lot of the same team that worked on The Cove. And our mindset at that stage was to make the most compelling film that we could, and what would that story be? And at the beginning, we called the film The Photographer, and it was about James's personal story. And we wanted it to be, I didn't want it to be a climate change film. I didn't want it to be An Inconvenient Truth or anywhere close to it, because that had recently come out. There were a lot of other films about climate change that were out in the public. And our mindset was, we've got James's personal story that's unique. Let's leverage that and make the film about that. And we spent about 1 year working on that version of the film, and we did regular screenings with people. And we got feedback from people saying, this is a fascinating story, but answer these questions about the ice and answer these questions about climate science. And through the process of getting feedback on the film, we realized that there was a much stronger and a much more important story to be told, with the story of climate change as being kind of the focus of the film. And James was still able to be the protagonist who could tell that story, and we can follow him on his journey around the world and discover something about climate. So that's kind of where I come into this, having spent now 5 years in this field with a lot of glaciologists and climatologists and learning the politics behind all of this. I feel like I've become very well versed in a lot of these issues, but I'm by no means a scientific expert on the matter. But
should we see some pictures?
Yeah, let's. We have one clip of the film, and it's there's a section of time lapses. I apologize, this is interlaced, this clip that you're about to see, but it is towards the end of the film, and it's a section where James is showing some of his time lapses to the world for the first time.
Can I just ask?
Yeah.
Chris, visually very persuasive. Is it scientifically valid?
You heard him say the majority of glaciers around the world are in retreat.
But what we see with our own eyes, that's fine for you as a scientist?
Yes.
There's no, just out.
And one thing that James will kind of clarify, this is representing a few years of history with these glaciers around the world. He's doing as broad of a study as he can. His cameras have documented, I believe, 30-something glaciers in the northern hemisphere. He's trying for it to be as representative of various locations. The story is very consistent amongst all these places, and people will sometimes try and criticize, oh, that's just a few years worth of time. The evidence that the glaciologists have captured is representing hundreds of years worth of time. The documentation and the record is very, very strong. It exists. And what James is trying to do with his skill set and with his images is to convey it in a way that people can understand and can just watch and feel and emote and recognize what's going on kind of at a gut level, as opposed to just thinking about charts and numbers and computer models.
Similar glaciers in the Antarctic Peninsula were fronted by ice fronts, so the ice would flow out and float on the surface of the ocean. And there's been a series of those collapsing over the last 30, 40 years. The temperature rise in that area is 5 times faster than the global average. And what you can do once one of those great big floating ice shelves has gone is you can put a ship in and you can get the mud cores that lay beneath it, and you can tell how long it was there for. And we're talking about 5,000 to 10,000 years. So although there are natural fluctuations in the climate and glaciers go backwards and forwards, this is an unusual event.
Exactly. And I think that's what the scientists are trying to confirm, well, not trying to confirm, that's what they know and they're trying to express. And that's what we try to represent in Chasing Ice as well, is that we know that there are natural fluctuations. Everybody tries to blame it on natural fluctuations. The scientists know that we're well beyond those known natural fluctuations. And that's something that's hard for the average layperson to kind of wrap their head around.
Interestingly, if I can just add, I was in Montreal at this session a few weeks ago. Northern peoples are giving the message loud and clear. It's happening to us. Reindeer herders are having problems because instead of getting snow, you're getting rainfall which freezes,
right.
And then the reindeer can't detect the forage and so on. So it's not just polar bears and penguins that are suffering, it's the peoples of the north. And those messages are quite difficult to get across, it
right.
seems. Oh, yeah, but no,
and the people in the low-lying areas.
The point I was going to make was those peoples have kind of clung on to a fairly tricky existence in extreme conditions where understanding their environment really matters, and that's where traditional knowledge has been so important, knowledge that's been honed over a Darwinian series of experiences over many generations, difficult to know how far, has left them with elders who say don't go out on the ice now, or don't put your reindeer here now, and they're all saying that knowledge is a stranded asset because the conditions have changed so rapidly and in such an extreme way that it's beyond their traditional experience. Now, I told this to a senior conservative the other day, and he said, what, you're going to change carbon taxes for a bunch of Eskimos? So, evidence can sometimes, it's this confirmation bias. If you're interested in that, you take it one way. If you're not, you reject it another way.
I just had some thoughts I'd like to share, and I think it's interesting how at the very beginning you asked everybody what they believe on climate change. It's something that James in his lectures, he does rather regularly, and he asks the opinion of the whole audience. Do you believe A, do you believe B, or do you not have a belief on the matter? And then James goes and he says, well, you're all wrong. Because believing in climate change is just like believing in gravity, or it's like believing that man has landed on the moon. These are scientifically known quantities, and to put it in the context of religion and belief, and to use that language, that it is a matter of something you can believe in or not, is something that the skeptic community has been very successful at planting and getting the general public to question their almost religious beliefs on this issue. I think that one of the main issues, one of the problems with climate change, and there's Naomi Klein has written some incredible articles on this, but one of the issues is that the solutions necessary for doing anything about climate change are somewhat inherently anti-Republican. They require regulation of industry in a way that half of the American audience just vehemently opposes. And you can't make any sort of progress on this issue without managing it from a very broad top-down perspective. And so there's an inherent conflict in our ability to make any sort of progress with that sort of mindset. The comparison to the cigarette industry is something that came up a little bit earlier, and it's something where certainly in America we had this very, very proactive campaign in the 70s, and then the Truth campaign trying to reveal the realities of how cigarettes do cause cancer. It's been revealed that the people that were creating those cigarette campaigns are in fact some of the same exact people that are creating the spin on climate change as an issue. And they're trying to confuse the general public about what's going on. And if they can create any sort of uncertainty and doubt, then they've succeeded. If they create the illusion that the scientists are debating it, then they've succeeded. It's much harder to create clarity and truth in this issue than it is to create any sort of confusion. And so when you're kind of basing those two comparisons, the ability to create, and your research, Lorraine, it kind of indicates that as well, like to get somebody from a perspective of recognizing that this is true to a deeper commitment that it's true, that's much harder to create that sense of truth and facts that are convincing than it is to create greater skepticism just by raising some questions.
What's your take on why your country is so the leading skeptic country on climate change?
So we get into the whole debate between the scientists or the journalists and who's at fault. I think there's a larger constituent that's at greater fault, and like Chris was saying, they are well motivated within their own business objectives to maximize profits. There are fossil fuel corporations. It is the richest industry in the history of money, and their goal is to maximize profits for their shareholders. And with that mindset and with that kind of psychology and worldview, they will do whatever it's necessary to make more money. And that's, as a business person, I understand that perspective. You know, to some degree, you kind of wish you were in that business and taking advantage of that financial situation. But it will take a lot of effort to convince those people that this perspective is inherently flawed. And the analogy that I like to use is slavery. I mean, there were really great economic viable reasons to keep slavery going. If I was a slave owner, I would like to keep my slaves. I'm sure it would be very, very good for business. And when you go through this great moral shift of consciousness, from saying, you know what, as a culture, as a society, this thing that we've been practicing for so many years, there's something wrong with this. This is not good for the future of humanity. It's not good for our people and for our country, and we need to make a shift. I'm sure that that wasn't something that the broad American perspective embraced. It's something that our leadership decided, you know, we have to protect our people, and we have to defend our people, and we're going to make this stance, and we're going to draw this line in the ground saying we're no longer practicing this inhumane practice. And that shift is something that I think we need to consider. That level of psychological shifting is something that we need to, for the future of humanity, embrace and recognize, because there will be major consequences. We can't predict exactly when those are going to happen. We do know that in America alone, there's been a 5-fold increase in natural disasters over the last 30 years. Those have great financial consequences. Those have great human consequences. And part of the problem is that all of those consequences are externalized. They are not counted. I don't pay for them when I buy a gallon of gasoline. I don't pay for the environmental destruction. I don't pay for the health destruction and the lives that are cost due to all these natural disasters. I don't pay for the cost of protecting militarily the oil supplies in the Middle East and all the governmental efforts to protect that oil. So with all those externalities, and with the great vested interest in the fossil fuel industry, and with the fact that the fossil fuel industry has such massive influence in our government, there are over 6 lobbyists for the fossil fuel industry for every single senator in Congress in Washington, D.C. Like, the environmental movement does not have nearly the same resources to compete with such strong, well-established, well-funded voices. And so that's the real uphill battle. It's how do we counteract that? There's one last analogy that I'd like to share, and I think I've kind of hit 2 things I'd like to share. One of them is, in America, there's this kind of anti-science campaign that's going on amongst the Republican Party, and it's attacking both the climate change issues, but it's also attacking evolution. And one of the kind of silver linings that I see is that there are people in the Republican Party who recognize that this is not sustainable. That is inherently flawed. And they kind of need to move away from that stance, because they're both on the losing. Well, I'm not going to touch evolution, but certainly arguing against climate change is on the losing side of history. They will recognize at some point in humans' evolution that this is something that they should have acted on. There's an analogy I like to share, because I think that climate change is actually, it's not the root problem, it's a consequence of one of the root problems. The root problem is that, tying back into the Anthropocene, we now recognize, the scientific community recognizes that humans are changing the planet, and they're the leading cause of change on the planet. And that change is a very, very deep-rooted, long-term history of how we've interacted on this planet. And it's something that's only really come up in a few generations, and it's something that hasn't been really integrated into our cultural dialogue of the fact that we have such a massive influence on the planet, especially with rising population. So when we recognize that it's not just the temperature that's changing, it's actually the air that's changing, it's the water that's changing, it's all of these other factors on the planet that are changing in a very, very deep level, and that humans are the cause of it. That's something that when the general consensus and the general public finally recognizes that, I think we'll be able to make some sort of progress on the issue. I make an analogy. Would you sit in your garage with your garage door closed with your car running? Nobody would do that. You know why you wouldn't do it. You know you would die. And if you're faced with that scenario, it would be ridiculous to propose that humans aren't changing the air in that circumstance. That's what we're doing to the planet at large. And it's just going to take longer for those consequences to be felt and to be seen. And that's really what the scientists are trying. They're trying their best. They're trying their damnedest to create that evidence, to create that imagery, and to convey it to the public in the ways that they know how within the current system. And the system isn't really set up to give them the proper time or voice. So those are just some thoughts.
I think I'm clear where you stand on the issue.
Sure.
One very quick final question. You sold the film to National Geographic. They've got a very rigorous standards and practices and procedure before any film goes out on that network. Did you have any issues about balance or questioning?
No. They took the film as is. It's something that we discussed quite a bit. It's something that was part of the conversation, and they respected our choices as filmmakers for what we wanted to include. So that was pretty fair.
Okay.
I also would like to say I'm representing my own opinions and not necessarily the opinions of the
American coal industry.
Yes. Yes.
Kim, last commissioning for BBC 1, 2 and 4, both from your in-house team and from oikish independents such as myself and many others here. What's your, just on the core proposition here, Doc's greatest creative challenge, do you accept that climate change is the final challenge?
I don't know about the final challenge, but I think it is a challenge. I don't think, I couldn't sit here and say that climate change wasn't a challenging issue to put on British television. I don't think that means it's impossible to do, and I think we'll see some examples of how we've tried to do it, and the range of ways we've tried to do it, and perhaps in a moment, if it's useful, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things we've got coming up as well. What I would say, just very quickly, I thought that I really enjoyed your film. I thought it had some amazing sections in it. I really, really did. What we broadcast on television, I think we're talking about very different mediums. I could see that having its place as an acquisition, but we are that kind of show can only be one of the many ways we try to reach our audiences. Right. Would it be useful to have a quick look at some clips, and then we can talk a little bit about opportunities and challenges?
Sure.
I think it turned up, so.
Across most of the Arctic Ocean, there are now just a couple of meters of ice.
We're seeing global weirding.
List climate change, major events.
In the name of science, the consensus.
Climate change is a toxic issue.
If current trends continue, then there will be open ocean here by summer's end, sometime within the next few decades. So the days of the Arctic Ocean being covered by a continuous sheet of ice seem to be past. Whether or not that's a good or bad thing, of course, depends on your point of view.
More of the frozen sea has been melting in the past 3 decades, and scientists think this may be changing the patterns of our weather.
A last-minute deal aimed at tackling climate change has been agreed at the UN conference in South Africa.
For the first time, it is recognised that there is a gap between pledges to reduce emissions and the cuts that scientists say are needed.
The deal was, we left the world in a better place than we found it.
The local people's health problems are compounded by gas flares, burning night and day throughout the Niger Delta. Asthma, bronchitis, skin diseases and cancer have all been linked.
We could have saved ourselves, but we didn't.
I want you to say hello to your very own human power station.
And there's a funny energy on the floor, so that as soon as it starts going down, everybody's getting really pepped up.
Dad is taking off his clothes!
Knowing how hard I have to work to keep their habits up is going to make me think about what I do when I get home.
The kettle's going on. Don't believe this.
The weather here has all the hallmarks of global weirding.
We're so far below average we can't even measure how dry it is.
In those 100 years, we've never had this kind of steep oscillations go from one year to the next.
That temperature change in and of itself makes no difference at all to our lives. It makes a huge difference to what we're used to.
It's essentially advancing a political agenda, and that has much more to do with governments, intruding further into our lives.
Say you had cancer.
Yes.
And you went to be treated. There would be a consensual position on your treatment.
Should we talk about Climategate? Because I don't accept your analogy really.
Okay, so just a very small taste of the range of flavours that we try to bring to bear on any subject, and I think that's what's really important for me as a broadcaster, and I think that's what you're really interested in pushing, John, is that any subject that I think about putting on television, I'm as much or more interested in the way it is executed than frankly what it's got to say, because it's really easy for us to come up with a subject and say we ought to do something about that. How we do it's really important. One of the reasons why our science coverage is doing well with audiences at the moment is that we're very clear about what makes a proposition on 1, what makes a science proposition on 2, what makes a science proposition on 4, and we try and vary the shapes and the way we bring those to the audience. So there will always be a place for the classic documentary. You saw Horizons there, you've seen David's piece. We'll have more of those. But we're also looking for things that, like Afterlife and Inside Michael Mosley on BBC 4, like the Young Ones Experiment on BBC 1, like Stargazing Live on BBC 2, change the tone and change the form in which they're delivered. So one of the things that we're doing coming up, and it sits in really interesting contrast actually to your feature documentary, is something called Operation Iceberg. It is concerned with the birth and death of icebergs, and how they move off the glacier sheet and into the open ocean, and what happens to them then, what's happening to them. But it's being done in a very, very different way. A team, we're working with the British Antarctic Survey and with the open ocean, the Polar Ocean Physics Group at Cambridge to land a team on the iceberg who will then live on that iceberg, in an operation of some scale. I mean, anybody who's been near an iceberg knows how challenging exactly that's going to be. But that's an example of trying to do something that touches on this area in a different way. And I suppose I'd kind of lay out three things, three questions or challenges that I certainly debate. I don't have the answers to, but I wrestle with, and I think that anybody who's interested in making programs in this area it's probably worth thinking about. I think the first one is, can we do better at conveying the evidential uncertainties in this area? It's something I believe in profoundly, that we have to get better at talking about risk and uncertainty in science coverage. One of the reasons why I was very interested in doing the Operation Iceberg in the sort of, for the sake of brevity, expedition approach that we're doing it, is that it's going to allow for a more conversational tone between the scientists that you're going to see operating on that iceberg. Yes, there'll be a lot of adrenaline. Yes, there'll be some jeopardy and drama, all those classic television tropes, but there will also be room for a more conversational tone than the classic presenter-led documentary series sometimes seems to allow. And that's very, very appealing in this subject in particular. I think the second thing that sits in my mind as a question is whether we do or don't, to what extent we owe climate change a particular duty of care as a subject to give special attention to outside of the normal range of things that we worry about when we're thinking, is this going to make a great television programme for a BBC One audience or a BBC Four audience? I don't know the answer to that. Actually, I'm not for a moment disputing that it's a really important issue. Where it sits alongside issues like, population explosion, or the way we have constructed the global economic system and the economic imbalances that tip out of the way we've constructed that system, there's a debate in my mind about, the hierarchy of importance between those issues, if you like. I think the third thing that I would sort of put on the table as a challenge, and again something I think about a lot, is why one of the reasons I think that climate change is hard to do on television is not just the reasons we've talked about here. It's also for another reason, and it really, in some senses, speaks to the audience's intelligence, which is that in many ways, climate change is a very, very slow-moving story. Not that much changes. For a scientist or anybody who's got a pre-existing interest in the subject, this bit of, the evidential dial has turned there, or there's a sort of dispute here, but fundamentally, the facts haven't changed, and the public's understanding of the facts haven't needed to change that much, over the last 20 years. And, once you've got it about climate change, you kind of got it. I think they're waiting for something new to happen before they will give their attention to it in significant numbers. Now, when you have a distinctive approach like your time lapse, or I hope our iceberg programme, or you've got a particular voice like Attenborough or Al Gore, that, if you like, can signal to the audience it's worth your attention again for a moment. But I think the audience are rightly parsimonious with their attention, because actually not that much changing in the story.
So summarising Chris owned up that science was partially to blame. Would you accept, despite all the things you cite and the clips you show, that we're to blame as well?
To blame for
Can't
what?
dump it all on them.
But to blame for what? What do you feel?
If you accept that there is not a huge number of programmes, and the programmes that there have not resonated enormously, and the controversy, there's probably more column inches on the Great Global Warming Conspiracy than on any of the clips you showed there. So I think
hesitant, actually.
Why?
I'm hesitant because I think that in many ways we're doing, and I don't mean the BBC, but sort of collectively the media are not doing a terrible job. If it's true that something like 10-15% of people are skeptics, do you know what? Given how many nutters there are out there, frankly, I don't think that's that bad. I mean, Chris, I know you would disagree with that, but seriously, I think that there's always going to be a lunatic fringe, frankly. Those words will probably come back to haunt me, but that's not that bad. The question, I think that the data over whether climate skepticism has increased since ClimateGate is more contentious than you presented. The BBC's done some polling on that itself. Has skepticism about climate change scientists increased since ClimateGate? Yes, but the same polling found that the public skepticism about climate change science had not increased. So people making an interesting and intelligent distinction between scientists who they felt had cocked it up, frankly, rightly or wrongly, that perception, and this underlying science. I think that's really interesting that people can distinguish between those two things. Do I think that we've been a little bit lazy about, just to your point, and to accept some of it on our shoulders, about thinking of new ways, whether that's new voices or new forms or shapes, the kind of things I was talking about, to attack this issue? Yeah, when I sit down to think about it, I frankly confess there's a small bit of me that would rather be thinking about how to, do a show about volcanoes, because let's fucking face it, they're easier. So yes, there's a bit of that, but I'm not sure that we're doing as badly as sort of you represent. Do I think there's an issue in some of the print media? Do I think there's an issue in the way that the absolutely fascinating, wild west of comment that online freedom has unleashed on this issue and others? Yes. I don't think as a society we've wrapped our head around how to respond to, bloggers and the volume that you can turn up online around a particular set of opinions. There are issues there. But I don't want to sound defensive and I don't want to sound complacent. I don't think we're doing as bad a job as perhaps some people on this panel feel.
Okay. Can I do, it's sort of running out of time, can I put someone on the spot? The person there, the person who put their hand halfway up before, the only skeptic in the room. Do you want to say anything, just not out of balance, but out of just interested to see what your view is of this debate? Because we're not hearing any dissenting voices. Or maybe I'm falling victim to the very thing we're talking about.
Dissenting voices?
What, sorry?
Why do you want dissenting voices?
Oh, because you, isn't it interesting? Well, may I put it another way, that I think we've been debating this for 90 minutes, and are there dissenting voices? Yes, absolutely there are. We're all aware of them. And I sort of think it would be vaguely interesting to... May I finish? May I hear... It'd be interesting to hear if there's anything we have said that in any way, look, James Ballock was a skeptic and he's now a true believer. I'm just interested to ask that question, which I sort of think is a fair question, to be honest. So may we just ask?
I just referred to when you said that climate change as a topic is overrated, because I come from Germany. Our company has produced sustainable issue documentaries since almost 20 years now. And I feel that climate change is certainly one big problem of the fossil and atomic fuels as we face it today. But it's just one problem of many, many, many that occurs. And I think I can only agree with what you say. It's so far away, it's like you cannot grasp what it is. But there are so many problems emerging that you can actually grasp, like emerging wars over the scarcing fuels. Or just, the uprising of the price. So I think that actually environment has a lot to do with saving money, for example. I thought that was interesting. I think in times of financial crisis, we need to, put energy efficiency in place more than ever. And the only lobby that I've seen was very good with using the climate change argument was the nuclear lobby, because they use that to come forward with, nuclear power is green, because it doesn't emit CO2 emissions. And in Germany, this has been the case, and they used it quite well, actually. So that was really scary for me that, just focusing on CO2 emissions and climate change, I don't think it gives you the whole picture, and I think the audience feels that. And just the last comment, I couldn't agree more that we need to focus on solutions now that, people can appeal to, because even I'm bored of hearing, the apocalypse, we will all go down, I can kill myself. We need to show people what to do.
Not a hardline skeptic, if I may say so.
One stat I just wanted to throw out, because if only 15% of people here think that it's a hoax, that is incredibly optimistic for me, because in America, only 36% of Americans know that it's happening and that it's man-made. So in my cultural world, that's a very, very different perspective. If America was only 15% dissident on this matter, the entire world would probably be operating under very different circumstances right now.
I thought your point about the wider skepticism in America around science as a whole is a really, really important one and a very interesting one.
Listen, I've got time for just a couple of questions. Is there anyone with the burning? Just there, the person there.
Excuse me, I came in late, so this may have been mentioned.
Sarah Ramsden was a commissioning editor of Science once upon a time at Channel 4.
I saw the iceberg film this morning. It's stunning, it's beautiful. I really, really loved it. Congratulations. But towards the end and the way you talked, I really feel hectored. Do you have any idea how the public loathe being hectored? And there's this, because the debate is so passionate and so important, there's this mood that comes into some of the films that you cannot trust and allow any doubts to come in, because the public can't be allowed to have any chinks in the armour. And in your film, I know that there's glaciers in the Himalayas and Antarctica that are growing considerably. And I know you mentioned very briefly the Yukon ones, but I didn't feel you could trust me with the information that is more complicated than was being said in your film. And so we'll get better if we stop hectoring and we stop not trusting in the audience to have complexity.
Sure. Sorry, was the word hectoring? Because that's not a word that we use.
It means sort of like lecturing, sort of finger wagging.
And I recognize, and that's why I kind of wanted to disclaim what I was saying here. I recognize that I get somewhat preachy and idealistic about the issue. I guess my frustration is if there were no alternatives, if there were no better options that were available, this wouldn't be so frustrating to me. This has become a very, very frustrating issue for me personally. Right. I fully recognize that, and that's why, at least with the film, we tried to keep the film very apolitical, and a lot of the balance of the film itself was trying to balance James's tone on what he's trying to express in the film too.
Can we just take one more lady there, and then maybe we'll squeeze in one more just there, please. Thanks.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting and informative panel. One of the major challenges about climate change docs that I find, at least I've seen a whole lot of climate change docs recently, is that I find that the voices of the people that are mostly affected by climate change are often overlooked. And as you said, like, climate change is really not that fast developing story. But in the same time, I find that the lives of people are changing extremely quickly. People that are experiencing directly the effects of climate change. A fascinating doc that I recently saw called The Carbon Rush by Canadian director Amy Miller actually does an incredible job at focusing the film's attention on the lives of people on the ground whose lives are heavily impacted by carbon trading, as well as activists and organizers that are focusing on solutions, like you spoke about earlier, that are a lot more important than representing the picture as a huge doom and gloom situation. So I just wanted to ask your thoughts about whether or not you think that maybe a shift to showing more of the human stories on the ground in documentary, besides the scientific ones and besides the political ones, could be an effective way, of telling the story.
I'm slightly hampered by the fact that I don't commission docs per se. I commission science and natural history. So, we're always going, in my slate, we're going to have a limited capacity for sort of, I think, that more sort of human doc approach that I'm not saying we don't do it, but more limited. I don't think if what we're talking about is gauging ahead of time, is that going to be of interest to a UK audience as opposed to should we do it for, its own sort of inherent reasons? I don't think there's anything in that that's going to be intrinsically more interesting to a British audience. I think you still have to think very hard about the approach. So shows, that there are a number of shows that have worked very, very hard on format and tone, whether it's, blood, sweat and T-shirts through to, some things on BBC Two, to bring lives of people living abroad into a UK audience in a way that makes them interesting. There's nothing in what we're saying that exonerates us from thinking bloody hard about format and form to make it, to get people to switch on in the first place.
Okay, I think we better wrap it up now, but I'm sure the panel will be around afterwards if any more of you have got questions once we're through. But thanks very much to Professor Chris Rapley, Dr. Lorraine Whitmarsh, to Jeff and to Kim and to Nick who put the thing together. Thank you all very much.